Good evening. Hi, thank you for being so patient for us. David and I came to the same conclusion, and we thought we just wanted to kind of get you thinking about the state being in Israel and the kind of balagan that you would encounter there. Um, I'm Tali Lavi, a writer and critic and one of the programmers for Melbourne Jewish Book Week. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. Welcome to this very special closing night at Melbourne Jewish Book Week. Please make sure... David, they've just seen you. They're very excited. Please make sure that your phone is on silent. David can't see you, so please do clap as you've just done, laugh and cry at full volume so that he can at least hear you. To read David Grossman is to surrender oneself to infinite possibilities of story and language and time, to an admirable audacity, to reckoning with hard truths. These literary, often but not always, multivocal encounters, virtuosic explorations in language and meaning, tend to brand themselves on your soul. Born in Jerusalem, David is the author of 11 acclaimed novels, 5 works of non-fiction, a short story collection, numerous books for children, a children's opera and a play. Several of these works have been adapted into international stage and screen productions. They have been translated into 45 languages. The brief time we have this evening precludes me from speaking about so much of this pulsating work, so please excuse this mere selection as I leave so many loved ones out. David's shattering first novel, Smile of the Lamb, Chiyuch Hagdi, was one of the first novels to address the occupation in Israel. Michiko Kakutani called it a dazzling work of imagination that forces us not only to examine the consequences of history, but also to recognize the possibility for their transcendence. See under love, Ayin Erech Ahava, asked the burning question, in the wake of the cataclysmic event of the Shoah, how is one able to create art? Indeed, how is it possible to live a purposeful existence within its tortuous shadow? It is a literary deep dive, an ode to Bruno Schulz. Be My Knife, Shethi Hasakin explored the nature of unbridled intimacy, a literary striptease of devastating stakes that unfolds through correspondence between Yair and Miriam, its 2 protagonists. To the End of the Land, Isha Borachat Mebsura encompasses both a pastoral of the land of Israel, a love letter, and a reckoning with its trajectory. This staggering work explores the wounds that violence and systems of violence wreak on the individual and society, the cost of the carapace that forms, while also being a lambent portrait of redemption of self through love, a work of great luminosity and pain, of exposed vulnerability. I am in resounding agreement with Paul Auster's comparison of the book's hero, Olga, to Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. She is one of literature's most sublime of women, epic in her flaws and humanity. Falling Out of Time, Nofel Mechutz Lazman, extends beyond the traditional novel into a territory of poetic gesture, a requiem with a chorus of mourners. It steps into the scolding of memory. Within its pages, grief is an act of living. David's non-fiction work includes The Yellow Wind, Hazman Hatzahov, Sleeping on a Wire, Conversations with Palestinians in Israel, Nochachim Nifkadim, and Death as a Way of Life, Dispatches from Jerusalem, Mavet Keder Chaim. They are overwhelmingly characterized by an unflinching commitment to truth-telling from the risky position of vulnerability. His writing in the dark, essays on literature and politics, is a gem which demands returning to again and again. And I'm nearly finished. You know, I've warned David about how long this went for, but I think it's his fault for accomplishing so very much. David's most recent book is More Than I Love My Life, Iti HaChayim Mesachek Harbe, an epic odyssey that recalls Greek tragedy, voyaging into the plains of intergenerational trauma, of heroism and betrayal, of love that is so great it scorches those in its wake. David has received multiple prizes, including Israel's Sapir Prize, the Frankfurt Peace Prize of the German Booksellers Association, France's Prix Médicis for translated literature, the International Man Booker Prize, together with his translator Jessica Cohen. As a voice of conscience, his resounds through Israel and beyond. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome David Grossman to Melbourne Jewish Book Week. David, I wonder whether we might go back in time to when you were a young boy and you discovered a certain Yiddish writer, one who many people in this audience are familiar with, Shalom Aleichem. Why was reading him such a revelation?
First of all, shalom to all the people who are there, and to you, Tali, for the nice things you have said about me. I even believed half of them. My love story with Shalom Aleichem started when I was 8 years old, when one day my father came to my room and he held a book and he said, "Read it, David," or David at home. "Read it, David. This is how it used to be over there." And when he said over there, immediately I knew that he refers to his childhood shtetl, Dinov. My father was a very authoritative person and rarely he spoke about his childhood. I felt that he gives me something very precious, as if he gave me the key to his childhood. And I took it and went on the window pane where I liked to sit and to read, and I started to read. And I was swept into a reality that I never dreamt about it, that I didn't know existed, the reality and the life of the Jews in the shtetl, in Poland, in Russia. And I started to read and I was immersed into it in such a strong way because I discovered a world, you know, a world with its own codes and rules and relationship and anecdotes and history and humor. And above all was a whisper of, a wind of mourning, lamenting, which I was unable to decode back then. I was 8 years old, but for me, what mattered was that it's the childhood of my father, so I started to read it. I remember even the pages were not marked with digits, but with letters, and it gave it even more a feeling of a sacred book, a holy book, you know, like the Bible or the Talmud. And I read all the stories of Shalom Aleichem. Most of them were not meant at all to my age. But again, I say, the privilege of being let into the depth of the childhood of my father was irresistible. And then I remember also that when I told my best friend in the Shikun, in the housing project, that I'm reading Shalom Aleichem, and I know the Motel Ben Pace, Motel the son of Pacey the cantor, and Menachem Mendel, and Tuvia the milkman. And he gave me a very funny look, and I immediately I understood with the intuition of a child, of survivor, children mostly are survivors, that I should keep these stories to myself. It's not Israeli enough, it's not militant enough, it's not tuned to the future, but it's tuned to the past. I looked back, I became suddenly a diasporic enclave in the heart of the strong, future-oriented state of Israel. And then if you give me one more minute, I'll just conclude this story because it's quite a funny one. In the Israeli governmental radio, which prevailed then in the early 60s in Israel, there was a radio competition of knowledge about different topics, detective stories, science, sport. And one day I heard that they are having a competition about the writing of Shalom Aleichem. And I told my parents, I want to go there. They invited for pre-auditions. They said, if you want to be pre-audition, send us this and that card or postcard. And my parents said, you are 9 years old. I was by then already. You are a child. And I went to the store in our neighborhood and I bought a postcard and I sent it to the radio. And I think a week later came a letter in an envelope. I still remember it. And they asked me to come and to be auditioned. Now, my parents really almost fainted. It was as if David Ben-Gurion himself pointed at me and said, give me my son, you're only one, the one that you love, give. So my father had no choice. He went with me to the audition committee and we entered the room, studio number 3A, I still remember. And the people there said, please, sir, leave the child outside. He shouldn't be here. And he said, no, the child is the... And I started to answer questions and I knew I had a very good memory, which I don't have by now, but I had a very good memory of a child. So I knew all the answers. And there started to be a kind of unrestness, you know, the feeling that I was so young and the other competitors were professors for Hebrew and Yiddish literature. So they made a deal with me, a quite unfair deal, but it was irresistible for me that I will not be let into the official competition of knowledge, but I will sit in the studio when they air it. And whenever one of the competitors will not know the answer, they will turn it to me. And so they did, really, so they did. And I was lucky enough because there were some people, some other editors from other radio programs present, and they thought that it would be a good idea to take this child and to send him to all kinds of people and places in Israel and to allow him to ask questions. And of course, the first ones I chose were football players, and then theater players, and then the president, and then all kinds of movie actors. And I started to work in the radio. And I stayed in the radio for more than 20 years until I was unfortunately fired because of political reasons. We might talk also about that. But all my childhood was in the radio. I was a radio child and I enjoyed it enormously. And it was really a present, a gift given to me by Shalom Aleichem. So I can really say that he changed my life. Thank you.
And we're very glad he did. In Sleeping on a Wire, Nochachim Nifkadim, in a conversation with you and Anton Shamas, Palestinian-Israeli poet and writer, your friend, writer Aleph Bet Yehoshua, otherwise known as A.B. Yehoshua, accuses you of being Jewish in a partial way, tied by obsession to some Yiddish ghosts from Poland. I wondered what you thought of this claim, both at the time it was made in 1991, and whether you think it might be less true, if it ever was true, of your work at this point in time.
I'm very much Jewish. I think this is what makes my beloved dear friend A.B. Yehoshua angry at me, because he wants us all to be Israelis. And I cannot collaborate with eradicating even the term a Jew or Jewish. And I still am looking for a way to combine the two, to be an Israeli, because I was born here, I speak Hebrew, all the codes of reality are decoded to me. It's a relevant place for me, and I wouldn't like to live in any other place. But I'm also very Jewish. Israel was created as a Jewish state, and I think of myself as a Jew. I feel the affinity to the Jewish destiny and to the Hebrew in which the worldview of generations of Jews was formulated for so many thousands of years. So I even will tell you that in a way I wish that Israel will be more Jewish and less Israeli. There are some qualities of being a Jew, even in the diaspora, as we say, Bagola, that I think Israel could have used in order to become softer, more self-ironic, more nuanced in its attitude towards life, because of the fact that Jews in the diaspora are a minority. I would love Israel to adopt some qualities of a minority and to let go of some other qualities of too much self-assuredness and too much militarism. Yes, too much power. And it's not that I think that we don't need to have power here. Don't get me wrong. In the Middle East, I want to be very well prepared for any development. And I'm very careful and suspicious even. And from these feelings, I want to achieve peace with our neighbors. But it will be wonderful if there is a kind of an option to, as I said, to merge the two, the Israeliness and the Jewishness. I think it will enhance our experience in this world. Thank you.
You write in one of your essays the desire to be Gisela in Writing in the Dark, of one of your motives for writing, and I'm quoting here, the wish to strip away what protects me from the other, to remove the usually invisible barrier that separates me from any other person, the desire to expose myself completely without any defences to the individuality and life of another person, to his most elemental inner workings in their unprocessed primordial form. David, you very much wanted to speak about, and I don't think one can abstain from speaking about this when addressing your work and philosophy, the attempt to understand the other, not as the other, but as you say, as being the other from within. Could you tell us about this compulsion?
Well, I sign every word that you quoted. I still think so. I feel that we are too entrenched, like a fist sometimes when we approach reality, and especially the reality in Israel, because you cannot live all your life in a political and military conflict without becoming more and more entrenched, more and more tough, more and more able to be a better warrior, a prepared warrior. And there are other qualities that I would have loved to see in my own country. I find a special pleasure in letting myself being melted, okay? I think my vocabulary is not very good, but to melt this layer that envelopes me as an Israeli, as someone who lives his life in war since he was born, and even before that, there was war. And there is such a feeling of freedom if you allow yourself not to be entrenched, if you allow yourself to approach the other and to allow this other to prevail in you, to echo inside you. There is in the Gemara, in the Talmud, the sentence says, there is no pleasure like untying doubts. There is no pleasure like untying a doubt, to get rid of a doubt. And I say, there is no pleasure like untying a stereotype, because it is so often that we meet people whom we know only by the stereotypes we have on them, according to the cliches that we use when we think about them. But if you allow yourself to be, with capital B, with this other, with this person, man or woman, a child, an old man, a dog sometimes, every other, and the world is full of others. If you allow yourself to melt into their option the way they are, and suddenly there is this pleasure of things melting and opening up, and you feel the complexity of reality and the multi-layeredness of reality. And when you allow yourself to do so, you become so rich. Your experience in life is so rich, is so multi-layered, is so nuanced. Why do we deprive ourselves from all these really gifts of life? It's hard for me to understand. And I know that while writing or through writing, sometimes, not always, unfortunately, but sometimes if I'm daring enough, if I'm devoted enough, if I'm courageous enough to be without defense mechanism and suddenly to become this other person, to be him or to be her, to explore life through the eyes of Ora, for example. Yes, I always remember, and I think I told you this story, that when I was writing To the End of the Land, Isha Borachat Mibsora, the main character there is a woman called Ora. She's 50 years old, Israeli, she has 2 sons, she lives separated from her husband, Ilan. And at a certain point, she's asked to bring her son to the military operation, to a gathering point of the military. And the book is about what happens to her and how she has a very strong intuition that something bad will happen to her son, and she runs away from the notifiers of the army. You know, in Israel, there is a very sophisticated machinery of notifying families who lost their beloved ones. And I wrote this book for more than 3 years, I think. And I was unable to really become Ora. I knew her. I cannot say knew even. I understood her, but I did not know her. And when I write a character, I want to know her or him, even almost in the biblical sense of knowing someone. And then out of despair, because I felt that I'm losing my book after all this effort, I sat and wrote Ora a letter, just a letter, again, out of total despair. And I said, Shalom, Ora, dear Ora, why are you like that? Why don't you surrender to me? Why are you so tough with me? Now, the moment I wrote these words, it pierced me how stupid I was, because it's not Ora who has to surrender to me. It is me who must surrender to her, to the option of Ora in me, to the option of a woman inside me, to the option of being a totally different other human being, different worldviews, different sense of humor, different sensitivity to bodily reactions. And when I understood it, suddenly the book started to take off. Suddenly I just had Ora, I knew her. And she led me, I did not lead her, I did not impose on her my wishes, my interests, my everything. I just, my inner constitution, you know, I just was open enough for her or to her constitution, and it paid off because suddenly she was writing the book. She was the locomotive of the book.
We can believe that because she comes off the page and she's just memorable. The stakes of writing for you feel perilously high. In Falling Out of Time, Nofel Mechutz Lazman, the centaur writes, my whole life now, my whole life on the tip of a pen. This might be connected to something you said when we spoke earlier, that you need to do this, you need to become completely vulnerable, you need to divest yourself of yourself, even when it's threatening to you, you said. What did you mean by this?
I'm not interested in books that are not dangerous for me, that are casual or ordinary. I'm not interested, not as a reader, not as a writer. I know it sounds strange, but I want to write books that are inevitable. Now, I don't know how that sounds, but inevitable, by inevitable, I mean that I must write them, that if I do not write them, a great part of my life would remain mute and wordless, and I will not know it. And I want to know my life, and I want to know myself. I know it's a very strange, presumptuous aspiration, but this is our only asset after all. It's not money, it's not power, it's not honor or whatever. Our ability to really, as the oracle in Delphi said, to know ourselves. And I think we can know ourselves only, I can know myself only if I go and write books that I had to write, that there was no other way for me to continue my life in a normal way, in a dignified way, had I not written about them. And it proved itself to be truth for me, not for other writers, but for me, for so many years now, that if I force myself in the beginning, because I have to overcome some fears, then I might get to a place where things will be different for me. I will formulate things that I was afraid to formulate by now. And you mentioned the book, Falling Out of Time. This is a book, Nofel Michutz Lazman, that I wrote after we lost our son Uri almost 16 years ago in the Second Lebanon War. And after Uri fell, I felt that I must write about it, because otherwise I'm unable to live, to be here in this life had I not written him and what happened to him. And I read some books of some other writers. Some of them are very good, wonderful writers who wrote about experience of loss of a child even. And it was very strong writing, but it did not answer my needs. And my needs were different. And then a day after the Shiva, the 7 days of lamenting that we have in Judaism, you know, I went and I started to write this story, the story about the parents who lost their children, and how can you continue your life after something like that happens to you, and how can you allow yourself to want to go back to life, and what you have to overcome in order to believe that life is worthy of something, because all these questions become hesitant and becomes dubious. Nothing is taken for granted, not even staying alive. And the strange thing was that the book that I wrote helped me. It is strange because it is as if against all instincts, but I felt that I cannot abandon the characters that want to be written, and I just need to give voice to some feelings and thoughts and insights that I had. And the book, as I said, the book brought me back to life, because suddenly there were characters that I had to feed with stories and anecdotes and even sense of humor and sensuality and passion. And when I poured it from myself to them, I found it in myself, and it surprised me. I really did not expect that to happen. And I wanted to tell a story not only of a loss, but of how long can we go far with feelings of grief and loss and come back to life from this point. Both things, both movements, contradictory movements, were very essential for me. And I thought, you know, I'm not a religious person. I'm not a believer. Almost the contrary. I need to believe that there is no afterlife, no second life, no second chance, that what we have is what we have here and we have to make the best of it. But I learned something, that even without believing in afterlife, there is one thing, one vehicle, so to say, metaphorical vehicle, that allows me to be simultaneously in the point where I feel both total nothingness, darkness, abyss, constant falling into abyss, and at the same time, on the same spot, I can feel joy and life and revitalization and passion. And this place where the two things happen simultaneously with the same intensity, for me, it's not in religion or religious belief, but in art, in writing prose and writing poetry and music and theater all arts. When I'm making art, when I'm a recipient of art, as a watcher in a movie or reader of a book or listener to music, only then, if it's really good, I can be in the place where the two things can coexist and give some taste to life.
You talk about nofel mechutz lazman, falling out of time, and I think it's a good time then to talk about language and your writing, because the language in there is kind of really radical. I think you find a vocabulary for grief in a different way, like maybe Paul Celan with his poetry. There are words that I have not encountered before, but that just spoke of so much more than what normal language or the language that we're used to using does. And so I wanted to talk about language and your writing and the thinking of the great Polish Jewish writer, artist, and critic Bruno Schulz. In Books That Have Read Me, again from Writing in the Dark, you write of Schulz's idea of human language compared to a primeval snake that was long ago cut into 1,000 pieces. These pieces are the words that have ostensibly lost their primeval vitality and now function solely as a means of communication, yet still always they continue to, as Schulz writes, search for one another in the dark. This is an idea that is both beautiful and terrifying. It feels to me that the connection between this image of language that has been fractured, that is tirelessly searching for its essence, and that the concept of tikkun olam is very vivid, and that the way that you view your role as a writer is connected to this.
I discovered Bruno Schulz years ago, and he really changed my life because, well, the way he writes, it's like every paragraph of Schulz is like an explosion of passion and imagination and nightmare and fears and curiosity. It's so rich, really. The more you read it, and for a time I read him like you read the Bible in a chavruta, you know, in a 2-3 people gathering together to study the Bible. I read him with magnifying glass, and he is a genius. He is really a genius. And he formulated in this parable of the pieces of the legendary mythological snake who are looking for their neighbors in the snake, yes, before the snake was cut into thousands of pieces, which are the words. I think every writer knows this feeling that you write something that you didn't know a minute before that you are going to write it, and suddenly there is a new entity in the world, and sometimes there is a verdict against myself that I wrote, and I was not prepared to, I didn't know it beforehand. And sometimes I wrote something that created, you know, this sparkle of imagination, and I know that just now one of the pieces of the snake met its neighbor, you know, after years of wandering in the world. And then this is when you write something that did not exist before, or you put together two words that you felt they are not belonging to each other, and suddenly there is this pow, this sparkle, and you know, yes, this is how it should have been. And Bruno Schulz, I don't know how much time we have to, and maybe I'll not tell all his life story, but because of him, I wrote Sea and the Love. Because of him, I felt that it's possible to write about the Shoah. He himself was murdered, I think 80 years ago. In a month's time, it will be 80 years ago. And he was a genius of words and of stories. And he created the reality of his own. And I remember that I was a beginner writer. I wrote The Smile of the Lamb, the novel that you mentioned. And you know, Israel is a very democratic place. Everybody can call you or write to you or stop you on the street and tell you if you wrote good or bad, or where are your mistakes, or where you have to improve, or from whom you were inspired and from whom you stole. This is the reality. I like it. I like this nature of this straightforwardness of Israel. One day a person called me, Daniel Shilit, may he rest in peace. And he said, I read your book. You, of course, are very influenced by Bruno Schulz. Now, I tell you, I swear, Tali, I never heard the name Bruno Schulz before. I know it shows of my ignorance, but I just did not hear Bruno Schulz. And even the name that was a little German, maybe I did not make it very inviting for me back then. And then at the House of Friends, I met the book and I started to read. And I tell you frankly, I was influenced by him and I was inspired by him, because I think many writers are inspired by him without even knowing or having read him. And I read all the book of Bruno Schulz. And then in the epilogue, the translator, Johan Brunovsky, described how Bruno Schulz died. That when the Nazis entered his city, Drohobych in Galicia, they enslaved him. They made him a kind of a painter who would paint the walls of Nazi officer. This Nazi officer had another opponent, enemy, another Nazi officer. And this other one, when he met Bruno Schulz on the streets of Drohobych, he pulled his gun and he shot Bruno Schulz dead. He came to the employer, quote unquote, of Schulz and told him, I killed your Jew. Very well, was the answer. Now I'll kill your Jew. Tali, I read this dialogue and I freaked out. I mean, I felt I don't want to live in such a world that allows such monstrous expressions. I kill your Jew. Okay, I'll kill your Jew. As if people are replaceable, as if it's only part of furniture, you know. And I went out of home. We lived then in the southwest of Jerusalem. And I walked there in an abandoned field for hours. I just felt I cannot go on living unless I will do something, unless I'll write something. And this was the beginning of Sea and the Love, because it is a book about how is it possible to want to live in this world after you know what human beings are able to inflict on each other. How is it possible that one wants to bring children to this life? How do you raise a child in a reality that has been so polluted and distorted by human beings? How can you maintain your humanity in such a horrible reality? And in order to answer this question, actually in order to ask two questions. One is, how would I have acted had I been then and there in the Shoah? How would I have maintained my human image? And the second question is the mirror picture of this question. Had I been one of the Nazis, one of the Germans or the Latvian or the Russian or all those who took part in the slaughtering of Jews, would I have had the power to resist it? Would I have joined the masses? Would I find in myself enough courage to remain a human being, a moral human being? I'm not sure, I don't know. The whole book is an attempt to answer these two questions, which I think every human being should ask himself or herself, even if they have not been born in the time of the Second World War. Of course, even if they are not Jews. But these are questions that are worth asking. And I think the more we see how evil is easily spreading in humanity, if we just think of what happens in Ukraine in the last 3 months, this horrible situation of one country invading and raping another country, another nation, these questions should be asked.
The figure of Scheherazade appears in various forms in your work. In Smile of the Lamb, we have Hilmi and Uri. In Sea Under Love, we have Anshel Scheherazade Wasserman who in an inversion of the ancient tale offers stories to the Nazi officer Nagel in the hope that he will kill him. And then there is Momik, who attempts to tell Wasserman and Schulz's story. In the Book of Intimate Grammar, Aaron Kleinfeld tells himself stories to make sense of the world and to protect himself from its corruptive force. Into the End of the Land, Ora burns with the need to tell Avram the story of Ofer's life, as if it will enact a magic charm of safety for their son's life. Tell us about Scheherazade.
What wonderful questions you have. I think every one of us has his or her legislative stories. Every one of us keeps telling new people about his or her childhood and how our parents did not understand us and how they discriminated us and how our siblings were tough on us, our teachers. And over the years, we learned to tell this story in a very sophisticated way. We become very good actors in telling our legislative stories. And we tell it and retell to new acquaintances, to our psychologists, to our friends, to people who we want to impress, to gain their sympathy, even sometimes their mercy or their love. And we do not notice to what extent we have become prisoners of our legislative stories. What extent we are trapped in these stories while reality might be totally different by now. Reality our reality can be much more progressive, courageous, clever, deeper, multi-layered, but we don't know it because we cling to the official, formal story, like a visit card that we give every new acquaintance. And I think that if we retell old stories with new words, and if we allow ourselves the courage to look at a certain story, certain text that we created, somewhat from a different point of view, we just move a little the point of view, and suddenly there are new nuances to the story. Suddenly, for example, we can understand that maybe Mama had also a Mama. And maybe Papa has the right for psychology. Yes, it's not only us, the sophisticated young generation. We are not that, I am not as young anymore, but that also our parents deserve to have psychology with all the complexity of psychology. And I say it regarding individuals, but it also applicable for nations. Every nation has the legislative story, the mythological story of how we fought our enemies and how moral we were and how cruel and brutal they were and how we overcame difficulties and blah, blah, not blah, blah, because it was important at the time, 50, 60, 100 years ago, it was relevant and needed and it helped to create the nation. But maybe now we do not need all these stories. Maybe now we are in a different place. Maybe we are strong enough to try to explore other options of treating our enemies, our neighbors. Maybe we can liberate ourselves. Maybe we can stop being a victim of our legislative story. And if we allow the story of our enemy to infiltrate into our official story, it will not ruin our official story. It will not ruin our identity, not at all. It will only make our identity richer and more, with more nuances of it. We shall be more in contact with reality and less with our nightmares or wishful thinkings. We shall be in reality, in life. It doesn't weaken us. On the contrary, as I said, it just makes our life richer.
David, I'd like to move on to More Than I Love My Life, Iti Achaim Mesachek Habeh. Both the Hebrew and English titles, which are quite different in framing the book, come from phrases proclaimed by the irrepressible Vera. David, who is Vera and how did this story emerge?
Vera actually, as we call her, called me one day on the phone. As I said, Israel is a very democratic place. And she had a remark regarding an article I wrote the other day on the settlers in the occupied territories. And immediately I noticed her very unusual accent. She had an accent that was a mixture of Hebrew, English, Serbo-Croatian, and Hungarian. It's all in the same character. And I asked her where does she come from, and she told me that she was born in Čakovec, a small city in Croatia, in then Croatia. And we started to talk, and she started to tell me about her life. And at a certain point, she stopped at the most important point. And she said, I don't want to bother you with my little story, but will you allow me sometime in the future to continue my story to you? And I said, yes, please do. I'm very interested. So the future came 2 or 3 days later. And again, she told me the story. And again, when she reached the highest of the story, the most strong point, she stopped and she said, no, I see I'm boring you with my little story. But by then I already understood the Scheherazade method. And I said, no, Eva, please, I want to hear the whole story here and now. And she smiled and she started telling me her story, and she kept telling me her story for the next 20 years that we were very close friends until she died at the age of 97. And I'm so sorry that I was unable to write her story before she died, but she knew I was writing about her. And all the time she was checking with me, and she said, David, she has the voice of Ben Gurion. David, are you writing this? And I said, I will be writing it, I promise you, but first I have 2 other books that I must write. This was A Horse Walks into a Bar and Falling Out of Time. And I told her one more thing. I told her, Eva, listen, I will write your story, but I'm not a documentarist. I wrote documentary books, but I'm a fiction writer. I must write you as if I'm writing a part of myself. You have to go through my DNA. I will not impose on you anecdotes or situations that could have not happened to you. I will not do that at all. But I will write things that could have happened to you, even if they had not. And I just want you to trust me that I will be loyal to you, even when I will be not very supportive of things that you did. And she said, of course, this is the license of the poet, licentia poetica. Write exactly as things used to be, or exactly as you think they could have been. And so I did, and I wrote her for 2.5 years. As I said, she didn't live long enough to read it, and I'm sorry for that. But I think, I want to think, and I heard from her daughter and her granddaughter, that they were also sure that she would have loved the book because it didn't flatter her, because it didn't try to beautify her. She was such a strong, crystal-like person. I never met a human being like her, really. I'm not just saying that. She was the strongest, sometimes the toughest, and at the same time, the most kind, sympathetic, warm, loving, protective person. And how these 2 poles coexisted, this is the heart of the story. And it's a story about a secret that torments a family for 3 generations because of something that Eva did years ago when she was tormented by the UDBA, the Secret Service of Marshal Tito, when she had to decide whether to betray her husband, who already committed suicide, or should she be more loyal to her daughter. And it sounds almost easy decision, but it was not an easy decision for her. And I tried to describe step by step how she got into this situation. How did it change her? How it changed the life of her and her daughter, Tiana, in the book Nina. How it continues to torment the family for generation after generation. And only when the story is being told, and only when there is someone who urges the storytellers to get out of their comfort zone, as it said, and to tell the old story with new words, only when that happens, suddenly things start to move, and suddenly there is a flow of fresh air, and suddenly life life is possible for the three women who were victims of this story.
David, now might be a good time if you would read to us from the book.
In Hebrew, I'm sorry.
Yes, yes, it will be a gift.
I will read from the very beginning of the book for 2 or 3 minutes. רפאל היה בן 15 כשמתה אימא שלו וגאלה אותו מייסוריה. גשם ירד על חברי הקיבוץ שהצטופפו תחת מטריות בבית הקברות הקטן. טוביה, אביו של רפאל, מרר בבכי. שנים טיפל באשתו במסירות ועכשיו נראה אבוד ומיותם. רפאל, במכנסיים קצרים, עמד נבדל מהאחרים וכיסה את ראשו ואת עיניו בקפוצ'ון שלא יראו שהוא לא בוכה. הוא חשב, עכשיו שהיא מתה, היא יכולה לראות את כל הדברים שחשבתי עליה. זה היה בחורף 1962. אחרי שנה פגש אבא שלו את ורה נובק שבאה לארץ מיוגוסלביה, והם התחילו לחיות כזוג. ורה הגיעה לישראל עם בתה היחידה נינה, נערה בת 17, גבוהה ובהירת שיער, שבפנים הארוכות שלה, שהיו חברות ויפות מאוד, כמעט לא הייתה הבאה.
In the novel, Gilly is the main storyteller. She is the repository, sometimes unwilling, for all the family's stories. What was it that brought you to Gilly?
First of all, I liked her very much, even though my ambassador to the story, if a writer has an ambassador to his stories, is Nina. I like her complexity. I like the way she feels alienated from the whole world. I like her bitterness towards herself and her sarcasm. But Nina is too remote from the heart of the story, even though she suffered the most from it. And I wanted, there was a temptation to tell the story from the mouth and the voice of Eva. But Eva speaks, as I described before, in such a funny, unusual, very creative language that she would have drawn too much attention to the language. So it leaves us with Gilly. And Gilly is, I liked her Israeliness when it meets the Jewishness of her mother and her grandmother. I like her sarcasm, and there's something warm about her personality, so I chose her.
The circumstances for the story's emergence contain this extreme urgency. There is the double threat of impending death of Vera and the dissolution of memory with Nina.
Yeah, I missed the first, I think, 5 or 6 words.
So the way that the stories emerge contain this extreme urgency in the way that all of a sudden the story needs to come out, right? Not the finishing of the story, but the beginning of the telling of the story.
I think it's because first Eva became very, very old. Eva and Vera in the book became very, very old. And Nina is starting to lose her memory. She is a demented person. And she wants to record with a video, she wants to record the trip because she knows that very soon she will not remember anything. And she dreams about herself or envisions herself sitting in one of those homes for people in her situation, looking at the movie that they shot in the trip to Goli Otok, the place where Eva was imprisoned for almost 3 years, the place where the distortion and even the crime was created. And she wanted herself to remind herself whom she was. I'm quite fascinated by questions of memory, what we remember, what we invent, how things that we invent becomes our memory. And even if it looks strange that we adapt foreign memories, but the fact that we adapt them and not others is also meaningful. And usually in my books, people are trying to look for, to remember things, to remember reality, and to make it theirs, even when it's not theirs.
This novel speaks painfully of intergenerational trauma. The haunting through the book and through the 3 generations of women's lives are the fractures that occur when stories are oppressed. Would you like to tell us about this? Gilly tells Vera about Nina. She does know. She knows even without knowing. It's such a brilliant line.
Thank you. Yes, as I feel I said it before, the book is about what we remember, what we forbid ourselves to remember, and how the fact that we allow ourselves to stand in front of these stories that have changed our life. And sometimes you see people that, because they do not dare to tell their own story to themselves, they doom themselves to live in parallel to their real self, to their real life. And because we human beings, we are very sophisticated creatures, we know how to adjust ourselves to this distortion, to living in parallel to the life that we should have lived. And we really teach ourselves to live in this made-up life. And only from time to time there is a feeling of pain passing through us, or even of mourning, because someone has been murdered if we chose the other life story, or the new story, the made-up story about our life. And our real story, the story that, as I said before, is only our only asset. It remains far away from us. And so it makes us live life that are false. And if we are able, if we are courageous enough to go back and to tell the real story, and this is something that maybe in life we rarely get a chance to, only in literature we can appeal to a higher instance and to be able to look at ourselves, to see our mistakes, to see how we cheated upon ourselves, how we were unloyal to ourselves. And again, literature is a wonderful way to tell the truth, just to be there and not to be afraid, and to feel how, even if in the beginning you are afraid to tell this story, but step by step, and I can talk about it now because I'm now in this period in the novel, in the story I'm writing. Step by step, the story that I'm writing becomes like a magnetic field to me. And it draws me into it against all fears, against all my little petty interests. But it just makes me expose myself to the story. And I can tell you, I experienced it several times in my life. I was writing a story and I was terrified to think what my parents will think about it when I'm done, what my wife will think about, what my children think about, what my prime minister think about. And what I learned that is, if you write truly, you know, without too much feuilleschtick, if you just write to the point, the people you wrote about, that you were very afraid that they will be hurt, they reacted so differently from what I thought. They were so liberated and they were so glad even, and they felt that suddenly their tragedy got words, that it's not mute anymore. I wrote a story about a horse walks into a bar. A friend told me a story that happened to him when he was, I think, 14 or 15. And he was in a kind of a youth camp in the south of Israel, and he was called immediately to take a car and to drive with the driver to Jerusalem to the funeral of either his mother or his father. Nobody told him, can you imagine? Who is he going to bury? And the driver didn't know. So it's 4 hours of hesitations, of all this inner, I don't know why, not competition, but inner struggle, Whom does he want to kill? Whom does he want to keep alive? Mama or Papa? Ima or Abba? And I wrote it. It's based on a story that this friend told me. And only when the book came out, he was able to give it to his children and to his wife and to tell them about the journey he did, which was quite different from the literary journey that I wrote, but yet it was there. And he felt that for the first time in his life, he's able to breathe with both lungs, that suddenly the story that tormented him was taken out of his chest, and he was able to be there and to be once more in this horrible, horrific trip of 4 hours from the Negev, the south of Israel, to the funeral yard in Jerusalem.
David, I'd like to go back to your reading. It's a gift to hear an author read their book in its original language, its mother tongue. Some of the audience listened and understood, and others heard the rhythms, the natural intonations. What does it mean to you to be writing in Hebrew?
It means a lot. It's the only language that I think I understand and I can decode. And I can trace the Bible there, and sometimes the Talmud there, and sometimes the most updated Israeli slang. And I like the way they play with each other, all the layers of the Hebrew, because it counts back so many years, almost 4,000 years. There are layers on layers on layers of memory, of identity, of everything, of a character of a nation is embedded there. So I feel very, very privileged to belong to this long chain of writers and thinkers and philosophers who write in Hebrew and read in Hebrew. And I mean, this is home. Hebrew is home.
David, over the past 3 sorrowful years of this pandemic, did you turn to art as a form of solace or as a source of entertainment or oblivion? What did you turn to art for?
Well, first, I must say that the first phase of the COVID, of the pandemic, it's almost unpleasant to say, but for writers, it was something we knew all our life. We are spending alone in a room, not in contact, too much contact with other people. We are used to solitude and enjoy it. Later, when it continued more and more, it started to get on my nerves. I read a lot. I made a kind of decision, one of those silly decisions that from time to time I make, that I will read only books that are older than me and write only books for children. Why children? Because of the optimism, because of the discovering of the world and all these energies of decoding the world. I read only books that are older than me because I felt I need some life experience to be injected into my veins, because we all were in a situation that we did not understand, didn't know a lot about, didn't know when it will end or how it's going to affect us and to change us. And of course, it will affect us and change us. Even now, it continues to do it. But I think after the first year, I started to write another story. I'm hesitant to call it a novel because I don't know if it will be a novella, a novel, a haiku poem. I have no idea. It's still in the very beginning, only the first year, and I get to know better, or I try to know better some of the characters. And I like this phase, which nothing is taken for granted. Everything can happen to everyone in the story. It's an interesting couplehood, the couplehood of a writer and the book, because I try to change the book and the book tries to change me. And it's a kind of a competition of power, of attraction, of how much am I willing to give myself away, as I told you beforehand, and how being in this specific story, how it changed my life, how it changed the life of my family, because I talk about it with my wife, with my children, with 2 or 3 good friends, and this is my reality when I'm writing. And it becomes almost more intense than the reality outside. And maybe also what can happen is that I will continue to write this story for yet another year, and then I will feel that I have consumed it, that I understood something and it does not interest me anymore, because I need my books to always keep something unsolved and unformulated and a little mysterious even to myself. And yeah. Thank you. You're very kind.
As in a prayer, a tefillah, I feel our last subject should be that of peace. David, what does the pursuit of peace mean for you?
You know, you come from a country, or you talk to me now from a country that did not have war for many, many years. I was born to war, my father was born to war. More than a century, we are immersed in war, and war is not only a word, it means so many things. It means animosity and hatred and making yourself narrow-minded in order to be a better enemy, and suspicion and violence and stereotyping the other and generalizing and losing nuances of your contact with life. So many terrible qualities. I think that if or when we have peace with our neighbors, the Palestinians, it will be a new beginning for us. It will not happen very quickly. I think the bad residues that run in our blood for more than 120 years, they will not evaporate. And in a way, even if peace came yesterday, it came also already too late. Because what we have experienced and the qualities that we have sharpened in ourselves in order to be more efficient enemies, they will not disappear. They will continue to poison our blood for many, many years. But if we are lucky, if we have courageous, clever leaders, if the Palestinians have courageous and clever leaders, we might, for the first time, almost the first time in our history, have a place that we can really call a home. We had some phases of having a home, having a kingdom even of ourselves, but they were very short. But I think the main definition of a Jew as an individual and as a collective is of someone who never really felt at home in the world. Never. Even in the most hospitable places, there was always the fear hovering above us to be persecuted, deported, expelled, genocide, of course. And never we had a place where the earth was not shaken under our feet. And I desperately want to feel, how does it feel to live your life without fear of death, without the sword hanging above our heads, without the feeling that we have to live by the sword and die by the sword. I want to have a place, a home of myself, to my family. I want to see sequence of generation of my children and granddaughters and their offspring when it comes. A place that will be totally my place. And when I say my place, I mean Israel is a Jewish place, but it has a minority of 20% of Arabs. and they should feel at home here as I feel at home, because it's also their country. But it will be a place that will be defined with the borders that will be agreed upon between us and the Palestinians. We shall know where we end and where they start, and vice versa. A home, in a sense that everything that happens here is relevant, is made out of your own materials, the bad ones and the good ones. A place that will be a home and not a fortress. We are very efficient at being a fortress, but I want a home, a place that will be softer, that will not necessitate all the time standing on guard, being prepared for war, regarding a peaceful reality as an illusion, a dangerous illusion. I don't want this distorting feelings that have rooted themselves inside me. Yeah, sorry for the long speech. You see now why I write novels and not haiku poems. Yeah.
Thank God for that. David, your exposure of self, not as a narcissistic impulse, but in the willingness to surrender yourself, to step without a flotation device into the sea of love and grief and trauma and memory and history, which is at the heart of your books, has produced some of the greatest literature of our times. You are a poet of the soul. Your chokhmat lev, wisdom of the heart, your generosity and pursuit of truth and peace is inspiring. We wait with great anticipation for the work that is yet to come. Thank you for being so open with us tonight. I hope that one day you might visit us here in Melbourne to continue this conversation.
I wish to be there. Thank you, Tali, for the questions you asked me, which forced me to think, and it's good. And thank the people who are sitting there whom I cannot see. And hopefully, as you said, maybe in the future I will come in person and be there and see all these people. Thank you very much.
Be wonderful.